The ratings promised safety, but some films hid nightmares the censors never even noticed, movies wrapped in harmless labels, masking horrors no audience was prepared to face. For decades, viewers placed their trust in the small letters stamped at the bottom of a movie poster: PG, PG-13, R. Each one was meant to be a boundary, a promise of what you would or wouldn't encounter in the dark of a theater. But in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, something slipped. A fracture appeared in the system, and through that crack crawled films far more disturbing than their ratings ever suggested. Some of these movies weren't merely misjudged, they were fundamentally misunderstood. The censors of the era were trained to measure content in numbers: how much blood, how many explicit moments, how many seconds of violence. What they couldn't measure was atmosphere, psychological torment, or the quiet kind of terror that lingers long after the lights come up. And so, films containing nightmare imagery, twisted implications, or spiritual dread passed beneath their radar untouched. Families walked into theaters expecting mild thrills, only to meet horrors crafted with surgical precision. Children saw things they could never unsee. Adults realized too late that the label on the poster hadn't warned them, it had betrayed them. Tonight, we uncover 15 films that escaped the scrutiny of the rating board movies that walked into the world disguised as harmless entertainment while carrying something far darker inside. These aren't just mistakes, they're warnings that were never delivered. And now, after all these years, we're finally opening the door they slipped through. Fact 1. It's Alive, 1974. A newborn nightmare misjudged as simple horror. It's Alive is perhaps one of the most striking examples of a film whose premise was too primal for traditional rating categories. A child, a symbol of innocence and hope, reborn as a creature of violence, is a concept so instinctively disturbing that audiences were shaken long before the monster appeared on screen. The film builds fear through suggestion: a delivery room drenched in panic, a trail of blood leading to an empty crib, parents staring into the distance, mourning not just what happened, but what their child has become. The infant is shown sparingly, allowing imagination to sculpt something far more terrifying than prosthetics ever could. The MPAA looked at the lack of explicit gore and allowed the film to pass with less severity than expected, but they underestimated the emotional violence. The horror lies not in what the baby does, but in the existential dread of parenthood twisted into something monstrous. Loving your child becomes dangerous, protecting them becomes impossible. It's Alive didn't simply frighten viewers, it tapped into a subconscious fear older than storytelling itself, and no rating could have prepared audiences for that. Fact 2. The Initiation, 1984. A sorority ritual masking a psychological breakdown. The Initiation arrived packaged as a typical college slasher, but the real horror lurking within its R rating came from the protagonist's unraveling psyche. This was not simply a masked killer stalking young women. It was a portrait of fractured identity, generational trauma, and the violence born from suppressed memory. The main character is tormented by recurring nightmares, visions suffused with fire, screams, and the looming presence of someone she cannot quite name. As her sorority puts her through rituals meant to test her loyalty, her mind fractures under the pressure. The truth becomes slippery, faces blur, nothing feels anchored. The MPAA focused on the surface-level slasher elements, the chase scenes, the blood, the masked figure. But the film's most disturbing quality isn't physical, it's psychological. The viewer is forced to inhabit a perspective where trust can't exist, where even the protagonist becomes a stranger to herself. When the final twist arrives, it reframes everything that came before, not as violence for shock, but as the tragic consequence of secrets left to rot. This was not the kind of darkness an R rating could ever fully articulate. Fact 3. The Gate, 1987, a PG-13. Descent into childhood hell. When The Gate debuted with a PG-13 rating, it seemed destined to be just another entry in the wave of kid-centered fantasy horror. Instead, it delivered imagery and emotional brutality that far exceeded what parents thought they were allowing their children to watch. The discovery of a glowing geode serves as the film's invitation to chaos. Cracks open, light spills out, and the world these kids once knew dissolves into something hostile. Tiny demons emerge unnatural, twitching creatures animated with stop-motion precision that makes them feel disturbingly alive. They don't just attack, they swarm, they invade, they overwhelm the mind before touching the body. The film's most haunting scene, however, isn't the demon horde, it's the moment a child embraces what appears to be his father, only for the figure to collapse into a melting, writhing mass. No gore is necessary. The emotional impact is enough to scar. The MPAA considered this fantasy horror, but fantasy shouldn't twist into existential terror. The Gate forced young viewers to confront the collapse of safety, family, and reality, all under a label meant to shield them. The PG-13 rating didn't warn them, it baited them. Fact 4. The Children 1980. Innocence turned into a weapon. Few films reveal the blind spots of early censorship as clearly as The Children. Given a PG rating despite its grim premise, the film revolves around kids exposed to a toxic cloud, emerging with blackened fingernails and the ability to kill adults with a single embrace. The imagery is deceptively simple yet devastating. The children move silently through fog-drenched streets, smiling as though unaware of the destruction they cause. When they reach out for a hug, it plays upon every instinct adults have to protect the young, and that is precisely what makes their attacks so horrific. Victims are left charred, frozen in terror, their deaths implied rather than shown directly, but unmistakably brutal. Censors believed the stylization reduced the impact. They were wrong. The horror doesn't rely on gore, it relies on contradiction. Innocence becomes fatal, kindness becomes lethal. The film weaponizes parental affection, turning it into a trap that no rating board could quantify. For viewers, especially those who encountered it at too young an age, The Children became an unforgettable nightmare, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are the ones we never imagined could harm us. Fact 5. Frogs 1972. When nature decided it was done with us, Frogs was marketed as a PG-rated ecological thriller, practically educational, according to its poster art. But beneath the swamp air and environmental messaging lurked something far more ruthless, nature turning predatory with methodical precision. The film replaces traditional monsters with a symphony of ordinary animals acting in unnatural unison. Snakes coil with eerie intent, spiders swarm in coordinated waves, lizards lurk in dark corners as if waiting for a signal. The frogs themselves croak louder and louder, filling scenes with an atmosphere so oppressive it could swallow sound. The kills are rarely graphic, yet deeply disturbing. Victims are overtaken by plants, suffocated by insects, and dragged into murky waters where the camera refuses to follow. Every death feels like a verdict delivered by the earth itself, slow, calm, inevitable. Because the violence lacked explicit gore, the MPAA labeled it PG. But viewers found themselves wrapped in a sense of inevitability, the dread of realizing that the world around them could rise up at any moment and decide they no longer belonged. This was not a creature feature. It was a quiet execution performed by the environment. Fact 6. The Sentinel 1977. A doorway that should never have been filmed. The Sentinel may have carried an R rating, but the true horror of this film lies beyond anything the MPAA of the 1970 seconds knew how to classify. This was not a conventional tale of demons or exorcisms, it was an encounter with the grotesque presented through unsettling realism. And that realism is precisely what slipped past the censors. The quiet Brooklyn brownstone at the center of the story feels wrong from the moment it appears on screen. The halls are too silent, the neighbors are too strange, and the blind priest stationed at the upper window seems less like a tenant and more like a warning. As the protagonist is drawn deeper into the building's secrets, the sense of spiritual decay grows suffocating. Then comes the infamous climax. Rather than relying on makeup or special effects, the production cast individuals with severe physical deformities to portray the denizens of hell. The MPAA allowed it, unable to categorize this choice under their usual content metrics, but audiences felt the ethical and emotional disturbance immediately. The result was a film that forced viewers to confront a kind of horror beyond gore or violence, a horror rooted in the uncanny and the morally ambiguous. The Sentinel was not simply frightening, it was unsettling in a way that made people question why it had been allowed into theaters at all. Fact 7. Something Wicked This Way Comes 1983. Childhood corrupted. Under a carnival tent, Disney's Something Wicked This Way Comes promised fantasy and adventure. Instead, it delivered a nightmare about temptation, aging, and souls sold for hollow dreams. Its PG rating could never prepare families for the darkness waiting under the carnival lights. Mr. Dark, with his immaculate black coat and unsettling calm, feels less like a ringmaster and more like a collector. His silver tattoos shimmer like contracts etched onto flesh. When he smiles, it's never with warmth, only with hunger. The carnival itself behaves like a living organism, mirrors that distort reality, rides that whisper promises, and tents that breathe with secrets. Children expecting whimsy encountered dread disguised as wonder. The MPAA misjudged the film's emotional weight. The horror here is not violent, it's philosophical, existential. It asks what people will trade to escape their regrets, and what remains of them afterward. The film lingers on these questions through dreamlike imagery that unsettles rather than entertains. This wasn't fantasy for children. It was a sermon whispered by a monster. Fact 8. The Car, 1977. Evil with no driver and no mercy. The Car was marketed as a desert-set thriller about a runaway vehicle. A PG rating reinforced that idea, implying a sense of spectacle rather than dread. But what audiences encountered was a shape of evil unlike anything they expected. A black sedan driven not by a person, but by intent. The car moves with purpose, choosing victims rather than stumbling upon them. It blocks paths, stalks on open roads, and circles survivors like a predator toying with wounded prey. The most chilling detail, however, is the absence of reflection on its windows. It's as if the car doesn't exist in our world, fully only enough to kill. Censors saw no gore, minimal death scenes, and therefore allowed the PG label. What they failed to realize was that the movie weaponizes helplessness. Children are run down in broad daylight. Adults scream as the vehicle charges from silence. Scenes stretch with unbearable anticipation as the desert wind carries no warning except rumbling tires that appear too late. This is not the horror of engines or metal. It is the horror of an intelligence that cannot be reasoned with, a force disguised as machinery. Fact 9. Burnt Offerings, 1976. A house that feeds on more than fear. Burnt Offerings arrived with a PG rating that suggested a gentle haunting, a film safe enough for younger audiences. What viewers found instead was a home that didn't merely frighten its occupants, it consumed them, slowly, intimately, and without remorse. The house watches everything. Its windows resemble eyes too tired to blink. Its hallways feel like throats, narrow, breathing, waiting. As the family settles inside, the atmosphere thickens, not with ghosts or monsters, but with malignant intent. Rooms darken on their own, objects move with unwelcome familiarity. And then there is the chauffeur, a pale figure whose fixed grin carries the power of a curse. His presence alone has haunted viewers for decades. The MPAA overlooked the true horror, psychological invasion. This movie doesn't attack, it erodes. The characters deteriorate not through violence, but through spiritual corrosion. The mother grows distant. The father unravels. The child becomes prey to forces he cannot name. By the final act, it becomes clear that the house isn't merely haunted, it's hungry, regenerating itself through the suffering of those inside. PG never belonged here. This was not a mild haunting. This was a ritual of possession performed by architecture. Fact 10. The Hearse, 1980. A PG encounter with the unseen. The Hearse entered theaters wearing a PG rating, a label that suggested a soft haunting or mild suspense. But this film doesn't deal in minor chills. It deals in spiritual suffocation, an encroaching sense that something cold and ancient is following the protagonist wherever she goes. The titular hearse isn't simply a vehicle, it's a presence. It glides through empty streets as if pulled by invisible hands. Its headlights shine like predatory eyes, unblinking even in total darkness. Every time it appears, the world seems to fall silent, as though acknowledging a force that predates human fear. While the plot includes little graphic content, the psychological assault is relentless. Doors slam without reason. Shadows behave independently. The protagonist's sanity frays one thread at a time, leaving the audience questioning whether the haunting is external or internal. The censors, focused solely on measurable content, missed the suffocating spiritual pressure that defines the film. PG was never meant for this type of horror. The hearse proves that terror doesn't need blood. It only needs the persistent suspicion that something is watching, waiting, and preparing to make its move the moment you're alone. Fact 11. The Boogens, 1981. Fear crawling up from the dark. On paper, the Boogens seemed like a simple monster movie, a remote mining town, strange disappearances, creatures lurking underground. The kind of premise that, paired with an R rating, suggested predictable thrills. Instead, audiences found a film built on suffocation, both literal and psychological. The mines are the true monsters here, narrow, winding tunnels stretch into blackness that swallows sound and hope alike. When the creatures strike, they do so from places the camera refuses to illuminate, dragging their victims into spaces that feel almost coffin-like. The practical effects rubbery, twitching, disturbingly animate work not because they're realistic, but because they evoke the primal fear of being trapped with something that shouldn't exist. The MPAA misjudged the film by focusing on its minimal gore. They didn't consider how terror expands when the viewer can't breathe. Every shot underground feels like a countdown to asphyxiation. Even above ground, the characters move as if the air is thinner, tainted by the weight of the mines below. As a result, the Boogens carries a potency its rating could never convey. It's not about monsters attacking, it's about the world closing in and realizing too late that escape routes don't matter when the darkness wants you. Fact 12. The Watcher in the Woods, 1980. A family film possessed by something else. Disney intended The Watcher in the Woods to be a supernatural mystery for young audiences. What they released instead was a film that radiated a sense of unease so profound that early screenings sent children crying out of theaters. Its rating promised something gentle. Its imagery delivered something far more alien. The forest in this film doesn't simply loom, it watches. Light flickers in unnatural rhythms, as if signaling from another dimension. A girl appears in reflective surfaces, blindfolded and pleading, trapped in a fate that feels ritualistic and incomprehensible. Even the human characters behave as if they're carrying secrets older than the land itself. And at the center of it all is Bette Davis, whose unsettling presence alone could shift a family film into nightmare territory. The MPAA saw no gore, no explicit violence, and assumed the film harmless. But what they missed was the oppressive atmosphere, the visual language of otherworldly intrusion. This wasn't whimsy, this was dread disguised as a fairy tale. Disney grew so alarmed by the reactions that they pulled the film, altered the ending, and quietly re-released it. But the damage was done. The Watcher in the Woods became a strange relic of a moment when a studio famous for magic accidentally opened a door it couldn't close. Fact 13. Mausoleum, 1983. A demon wearing human skin. Mausoleum presented itself as another possession story until it didn't. Beneath its R rating lurked a blend of bodily mutation, supernatural eroticism, and demonic violence that far surpassed what audiences expected from its label. It was the kind of horror that seeped into the subconscious, powered not by gore alone, but by transformation that felt biological and spiritual all at once. The scenes of metamorphosis remain its most unforgettable elements. Skin ripples as if something beneath it is trying to break free. Eyes blaze with a neon intensity that suggests possession isn't just spiritual, it's cellular. The protagonist's identity fractures in ways that are both sensual and monstrous, forming a disorienting duality the rating board never anticipated. Because the gore wasn't constant, the MPAA allowed it to pass as standard horror. They didn't account for the psychological violation that permeates every frame, the sense that the human body is no longer a home, but a prison being remodeled by something ancient and hungry. The film earned a cult following for its audacity. But for many viewers who walked in expecting a typical rated thriller, Mausoleum became something else entirely. A reminder that some horrors don't need excess, they only need the moment you realize the thing wearing a human face isn't human at all. Fact 14. The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane, 1976. A fairy tale wrapped in shadows. At first glance, The Little Girl Who Lives Down the Lane masquerades as a quiet drama about independence and solitude, but beneath its serene exterior lies a story steeped in danger, exploitation, and the kind of dread that blooms slowly, like a bruise under the skin. The rating board never recognized just how predatory and claustrophobic this film truly was. The unsettling tension comes not from what is explicitly shown, but from what is allowed to linger. The interactions between the young protagonist and the adult man who fixates on her are coded in menace unspoken, yet unmistakable. The camera captures glances that feel wrong, pauses that stretch too long, and spaces where innocence becomes a battleground. Because the film lacked graphic violence, the censors dismissed it as a mature drama, but the psychological warfare at its core was far more disturbing than spilled blood. It's a tale of a child forced to navigate dangers no child should ever confront, a struggle for survival hidden within quiet conversations and locked rooms. Years later, critics revisited the film and questioned how something so thematically charged received such a permissive rating. The answer is simple. The MPAA looked for actions, not implications, and this film's horrors lived in the shadows between lines of dialogue. Fact 15. Tourist Trap. 1979. When PG became a trap of its own. If Tourist Trap taught us anything, it's that terror doesn't need violence to be scarring. It only needs silence, mannequins, and a smile that shouldn't be alive. Somehow, this fever dream of psychological torment was allowed to enter theaters under a PG rating, as if it were a soft thriller meant for a young audience. The truth was far harsher. The film's mannequins don't simply stare, they seem to listen. Their glassy eyes glint with something that feels aware, and when the killer's distorted voice echoes across empty rooms, it's less like a slasher taunt and more like a psychic intrusion, an assault meant to unravel you from the inside. Nothing is graphic, yet everything feels invasive. This is precisely how the film avoided stricter scrutiny. The MPAA didn't see blood or broken bone, they didn't see wounds, but they overlooked the real engine of fear, manipulation, sensory overload, and the uncanny terror of being turned into an object. The movie's most horrifying scenes occur in complete stillness, with the killer forcing victims to face mannequins that seem to breathe. Many viewers who saw it as children recalled nightmares lasting weeks. The censors didn't understand what they had approved. They measured content, not trauma, and Tourist Trap slipped through their fingers like a whisper. Bonus: Night of the Lepus, 1972, a PG illusion that hid a fever dream. At first glance, Night of the Lepus sounded like a harmless oddity, giant rabbits terrorizing a small community. The premise alone seemed too absurd to frighten anyone. Combined with its PG rating, audiences expected camp, maybe even unintentional comedy. What they received instead was a film that operated in an uncanny valley between realism and nightmare, a place far more disturbing than its premise suggested. The opening scenes immediately betray the film's innocent facade. Newscast-style footage documents ecological collapse, dead livestock, and rising panic across rural farmland. There is no humor here, only the sense that nature has slipped out of balance in a way that humanity cannot contain. When the mutated rabbits begin their assault, they are shot not as whimsical creatures, but as predators, massive silhouettes bounding through the dark, eyes glowing with an unnatural brightness. What unsettles viewers most is the film's unwavering seriousness. Every attack is framed as though occurring in a documentary. Screams are abrupt and raw. Victims vanish beneath clouds of dust and debris. The implied violence becomes more horrifying because the camera refuses to linger. It cuts away just late enough to let your imagination fill in what it wasn't allowed to show. And then there are the sounds. The rabbits' distorted shrieks, high-pitched, almost childlike, slip beneath conscious defense and lodge themselves in memory. The MPAA never accounted for sound as a weapon. The censors judged Night of the Lepus by its premise. They never anticipated that sincerity could make the absurd terrifying. A PG label made it seem harmless, but for many who watched it young, this film became their first surreal, inescapable nightmare. If these films proved anything, it's that the warnings printed on posters were never meant for the horrors that slipped through. The censors looked away, the audience never saw it coming, and the nightmares they unleashed are still echoing long after the reels stopped turning. There are more stories like these films that hid behind safe labels, movies that carried darkness disguised as innocence. If you choose to stay, we will keep digging. We will keep unearthing what was misplaced, misjudged, or quietly ignored. The deeper we go, the more truth we'll find in the shadows, and shadows never lie.